to continue? If we are, if you can bring the witness in, please.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we are ready to proceed. May I ask the usher to bring in the witness, please?
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, you may proceed, Counsel, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome back, Professor Saine.
Thank you.
Before the short break, we were talking about the background to the 1994 coup d'etat and the factors that led to the coup d'etat. And you discussed the first point, which is the personal factor, the personal motivations which led to the coup d'etat. Those are the individual factors. Could you now proceed and tell us about the organizational or institutional factors that you identified in your report?
Thank you, Lead Counsel. Military institutions are very complex. Some would say that's an understatement. But they embody and in so many ways model the larger society in terms of their organizational structure, rank, hierarchy, training, orientation, and a host of other things. In these institutions are also elements of conflict, order, disorder, and cleavages, differences in training and rank. These breed competition, conflict, especially as they compete over limited resources. They also vie for prominence vis-a-vis their civilian counterparts, politicians. So in a sense, in looking at this organizational structure, we want to look at the ways in which the culture itself generates forces, factors, and reasons that in fact may contribute to a coup d'etat. In fact, it is argued that military organizations and institutions do have an ideology that makes them believe that they are the best in developing institutions and countries. I call this the modernizing military view. And we have been pretty much disposed of that idea. I mean, this idea has been quite prevalent, but not as much as it used to be. In sum, it is an important place to look at to assess the causes of the 1994 coup d'etat.
Could you take a look at paragraph 20?
20, okay.
Which you identified the GNA, as it then was,
yes,
a fractured institution characterized by cleavages based on rank,
yes,
ethnicity, salary, and other material differences. And you also identified the problems with regards between the junior officers and the Nigerian senior and Gambian senior officers. You identified this you suggested that in well or in highly trained professional armies, these issues you identified would be factors that would be a source of discipline and order and stability, as opposed to what happened in the Gambia National Army.
Yes.
Could you further elucidate on that?
Military institutions are very structured. There's hierarchy, there's order, there's discipline for the most part. And the hierarchy makes it possible to maintain discipline as a result. Procedures are very much defined, very well defined. And there's a chain of command which makes it possible to resolve conflict between and within ranks. There's a chain of order. Now, in the face of poor training, limited resources, and cleavages based on ethnicity, sometimes class and religion, exacerbated by economic differentiation, and against the backdrop of societal problems, the military then becomes a major player within the political process. What I'm basically suggesting is these elements that I identified make it a fertile ground for the occurrence of coup d'etats. Ambitious young men, in this case, were affected by those limitations within the army.
You also identified the divide, or rather the divided loyalties, and the political divisions and the ethnic divisions within the army at the time. How did this mix contribute to the organizational factors?
In many, many important ways. It is argued that those in the top brass of the military, because of their rank, their class orientation, in many ways had similar interests with their civilian political counterparts. And it went all the way down, so that those at the bottom, the rank and file, had less in common economically and had a less sympathetic orientation, political orientation, to the elite. What that basically suggests is a deep political divide, so that the divisions in the army replicated the divisions in society.
It is said by some witnesses that the officer corps in the army was a reflection of what you have just said, those political divisions in our society. Cronyism, the Banjul Mafia, the Terry Kafo, the Bakari Dabo group, and the Sehu Sabali group, all represented in the army, vying for control and authority. Does that reflect, is it a reflection of the findings you have made in your studies of this subject?
Yes, and not only mine. I mean, there have been others too that have come to similar conclusions. John Weissman, Elizabeth Vidler, Ibrahim Assise, and many others have come to similar conclusions. And this is not only true of the Gambia. When you look at coup d'etats in the former Zaire and Ghana, ethnicity and the replication of the conflicts in society in the army itself became quite important.
What impact did this have on civilian control or civilian security for the army?
Well, it really didn't have a positive impact or effect. In fact, many military regimes or armies in West Africa and possibly throughout much of the third world do not subscribe to the notion or principle of civilian supremacy. In fact, they believe they do better than the civilians when it comes to running these countries, and consequently decide to intervene.
In your report, in paragraph 23, you put it thus: yet the general belief amongst most military organizations in Africa at the time was the army was justified to intervene because of its putative professional qualities of efficiency and professionalism.
Yes.
In fact, many scholars of modernization theory, including Huntington, argued the army was most suited to modernizing a country rather than civilians. I term this the modernizing military view.
Yes.
Was that also a view held by Gambian soldiers, you think?
I believe so. And I think it was also a view held by many Gambians in the population.
So, in paragraph 24, the conclusion you have on this particular issue is quite interesting. Could you kindly read it out, paragraph 24?
24.
Page 11.
Okay. To the contrary, the GNA was for all intents and purposes dysfunctional and lacked the discipline to carry out its national mandate of protecting the nation. In fact, it became complicit and a party to the rivalries and factionalism that was rife in society. Jammeh and his coup conspirators, aware of these anomalies in the GNA, believed a coup could be successfully executed. Thus, a combination of personal grievances, political ambition, and greed, alongside organizational, institutional failures, were important contributory factors in the 1994 coup d'etat.
Good. So now we can move on to the societal and environmental factors that you identified. Let's discuss now the societal and environmental factors you identified.
Yes. One of the important things in looking at the 1994 coup, as in coups in other parts of the world, is to look at society as an entity. How is society organized? What are the important groups? How is prestige and how are, more importantly, resources distributed? Who gets what and who doesn't, and why? What are the class divisions, the ethnic, racial in some cases, religious, in fact, regional differences too? All this come to play when coup d'etats are analyzed at the environmental societal level. What is also clear at this level of analysis is the fact that these societies are in transition for the most part, and over time breed deprivation, discontent, that in fact are very important in contributing to coup d'etats within those societies. So it is an important level to look at as it lends or provides another lens through which to analyze coup d'etats.
You mentioned certain groups in your report
Yes.
as a reflection of some of these problems you identified. You mentioned the Ken Street Vu, for instance, and the Terry Kafo. What is the role played by groups of this nature in this important debate?
They played a very important role insofar as they were sometimes hotbeds of contention. Many of them were young intellectuals, maybe at the sixth form. Some had just graduated from university. Others were in the civil service. They were part of the evolving elite. They provided the ideological fodder for discussion. Some of them had been trained in African universities, others in Western universities. So they came back with a lot of ideas about change. They were disgruntled, for some of them, about the pace of change and development in the country. They were also imbued by ideas of Pan-Africanism. You remember Stokely Carmichael and many others did visit the country, among others. The ideas of Nkrumah also played a major role in sensitizing and raising the political awareness of Gambians during that time. What I'm saying is, it created a very fertile ground for discussion as well as questioning the very basis of political legitimacy of the government in place. And over time, I think their ideas began to have effect and permeated much of society, influencing the young ones as well.
Thank you. Take a look at paragraph 28 of the report. Perhaps maybe you should read it out.
Okay. By the time of the 1994 coup d'etat, Gambia had transformed into a deeply divided social and economic formation. And it also became apparent that the PPP and Jawara overstayed their welcome in power, which added another critical dimension to the growing expectation that elections alone could not and would not dislodge the government. And the 1992 presidential elections made this perception all the more evident and was used as fodder to fuel this widely shared sentiment. And as noted earlier, charges of endemic corruption, inflated travel reports, and per diems increased popular discontent and distrust in government and resulted in declining legitimacy for the government and the PPP itself. Internal factionalism and growing distrust among its members, especially after Jawara's announcement and failure to select a successor at Mansa Kanka, nursed perceptions of a power vacuum, with growing expectation that the army needed to step in and avert further decline of the economy and the polity. In sum, these societal, environmental factors greatly contributed to the coup d'etat.
You also went on to identify sub-regional factors.
Yes.
Could you take us through them very quickly?
Yes. The 80s were very turbulent times. The entire subcontinent, and especially the West African subregion, was engulfed in conflict, be it in Liberia, Sierra Leone. Many of the countries were also led by military regimes. So when it came to democracy and democratization, there was a very significant deficit. Except for the Gambia, where there was some semblance of democracy and stability. And Gambia was very much invested, and Sadauda was, in restoring peace and order in this very volatile sub-region. Gambians served in Liberia, ECOMOG, ECOMIG, among others. But this was to have a contagion effect, I suggest. By that I mean the instability that engulfed Gambia began to have a knock-on effect, began to seep in to the country itself. And over time, that too contributed to the coup d'etat of 1994. I don't believe this is the most important factor. Some would say this is the dependent variable, but it nonetheless contributed in some degree to the coup because Sadauda became increasingly more invested in resolving the conflicts in the subcontinent.
How about the service by Gambian forces in Liberia as part of ECOMOG troops to help deal with the peace and security problems in Liberia? How did that affect Gambia?
It affected Gambia insofar as many of them coming back and the failure of government to pay them their salaries or their per diems created frustration leading to several demonstrations against the government at State House. Many of them also felt that the government was not very receptive to their demands. I believe over time this was to create deep resentment against the government. And these combined with societal factors, internal military conditions, personal ambition, all culminating to cause the coup d'etat.
And how about the effect of the wars that were being fought in Liberia and Sierra Leone at the time, and their effect on Gambia, for instance, the influx of refugees and so forth? Has that had any effect on the situation?
Gambia, being a very small country and an economy that was teetering on collapse, was further burdened by the influx of these refugees. While there was some international help, I don't believe it went far enough in curbing the problem. And it created some kind of societal instability. The refugees could not be easily absorbed, and economic resources, as a result, were severely strained. And I think this also added to the perception that the government wasn't doing enough. And I think this also contributed indirectly to the coup d'etat.
Thank you very much. I'll now move on to the second pre-assigned question.
Yes.
Which is, what were the circumstances and factors that enabled the gradual erosion of human rights and democratic norms and ultimately led to the creation, consolidation, and sustenance of the Jammeh dictatorial regime? And you have that addressed in page 14 of the report onwards.
Yes. Jammeh and his cohort, the FPRC, engineered the process, the electoral process, in such a way as to make it favorable to themselves. They created an independent electoral commission that they appointed themselves, or Jammeh appointed himself. And after that, a constitution was quickly drafted and passed with very favorable terms for Jammeh himself. The age limit, the term limits were all expunged from the constitution. In addition to that, Decree 45 gave Jammeh and the AFPRC the right to seize, arrest, detain, interrogate individuals who were suspected or perceived to be enemies of the regime. In addition, Decrees 70 and 71 were intended primarily to muzzle the press. So a combination of legal means, formal legal means, were utilized by the regime in an effort to perpetuate itself. And I can go on and give more examples. Banning of political parties. All the major political parties were banned, except for DOI and the newly emerging UDP. The death sentence was restored. And Jammeh was to use this in the future to execute 12 Gambians, well, including some Senegalese.
In a sense, you are saying that primarily Jammeh used the Constitution to engineer perpetuating himself in power.
Yes.
First, by removing the age limits,
Yes.
that would have barred him from contesting presidency.
Yes.
And removing the term limits, that would have limited the number of times he served as president. And he used other means as well. You mentioned Decree 45 and so forth.
Yes.
But in fact, the Constitution went through fundamental changes over the years. In fact, 52 amendments during that short period of time. Many of them seem to have been aimed at strengthening his authority.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
There is this provision which enabled Jammeh to dismiss judges for the first time
Yes.
in Gambia's constitution.
Yes.
There is also the provision which enabled him to do business
Yes.
for the first time. All that helped in giving him more powers.
Yes.
To
Even the fact that elections, I mean, the 50+1 was also expunged, which came in the end to bite him. I wouldn't mention where, but cost him quite a bit of angst.
Wonderful. The commission looked at the muzzling of the press, and we learned that more than 140 arrests were made of journalists, and media houses were attacked.
Yes.
Would you say that it's a correct conclusion to say that muzzling of the media and attacking journalists also helped in creating a dictatorship for Jammeh? Because
Absolutely. I think this was a very calculated effort on the part of Jammeh and the AFPRC to ensure that there was no dissent or expression that would undermine their grip on power.
how about the banning of political leaders? What was the effect of that?
Well, it eliminated practically all the competition. When you banned the PPP and the other major parties and politicians, you virtually leave yourself alone. I mean, the playing field becomes very uneven. And in addition to charging candidates to pay, I believe at the time, $1,000, which was about $10,000. That was a lot of money at that time, and few could afford that. I think you also needed signatures, about 5,000, among other things. I wrote this, 25 years ago, so I'm still fuzzy on the numbers. But yes, these were just calculated efforts to basically limit competition.
And for the first election, the campaign period, is there anything to be learned from that?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was shortened.
1 week?
I think it was about a week and a half, at most, 2. It was truncated to the point where only Jammeh could benefit. But in the meantime, he had the Meet the Farmers tour, which he went around the country and basically canvassing for votes. So,
But that aside, he created the NIA.
Yes.
What effect did that have?
a culture of silence in some was created. They arrested, they tortured, they killed, they disappeared, you name it, in an effort to ensure little, if any, resistance from the population. Meanwhile, the press remained muzzled. People disappeared, some killed, tortured, printing houses set afire. So really, it was very calculated. He knew basically what he was doing. He learned well from Ghana, from Jerry Rawlings.
And come November 11, to test his power, what happened? And what impact did that have?
November 11th is an infamy. It was orchestrated primarily to eliminate the perceived enemies of Jammeh and the AFPRC. It was a
Perceived enemies within where?
within the military, within the army. And I think it was a very calculated effort to send a very strong message to anybody who dared challenge his rule. And the consequences were disastrous.
The evidence received from Sana Bairo Sabali and others is that the ringleaders of November 11 were executed, including people, officers from very close to where you hail from, Balangar boys.
Well, I'm from Balangar too.
Yes. Abdullah Fall, Fafanyang, and others.
Yes.
What was the impact of that?
Devastating, nationally, and within the military itself. I think it took away the innocence of Gambians. Never in the history of this country did we ever witness such wanton slaughter of individuals in the military. In other words, we were dispossessed. We were disabused of our innocence in some.
But that would not be the end of the killings in order to maintain his grip in power. In paragraph 39 of your report, you talk about groups that Jammeh put in place to eliminate opposition. Could you discuss more about that?
Well, in addition to the legal formal means of maintaining power and the use of brutal force, Jammeh also had clandestine groups that engaged in atrocious acts of violence against citizens. The Green Boys, the Junglers, Black, just to name a few, did just that. It was extrajudicial killings, something separate and apart from what the NIA would typically do.
Examples?
Of the killings?
Yes, of the activities of those groups you mentioned, Green Boys, Black,
Yes.
Junglers.
Well, the assassination of Dede Haidara, the disappearance of Chief Mane, amongst others. For the Makalo, I'm not really sure what ever happened to Fode Makalo. It is said he died in Mali. Some say he was executed. It's still unclear to me.
Clear case of enforced disappearance.
Yes, yes.
But we've heard the junglers testify about the killings of a lot more people, ostensibly under the direction or ordering of Jammeh. So, in a sense, you're telling us that the violence and intimidation served as the foundation and subsequent consolidation of the Jammeh regime.
Yes.
You maintain that conclusion.
Yes.
But he also used other institutions of state. I'm referring specifically to paragraph 40 of your report.
Yes.
The judicial branch, the bar, and other institutions. Could you tell us about that?
The contention I make in this paragraph is that in addition to the things we already mentioned, Jammeh also used judges. He used the courts. He used Nigerian mercenary judges in particular to render verdicts that were favorable to him or his position. Many Gambians were put away on trumped-up charges, especially if they were perceived to be threats to the regime and Jammeh himself. He used Gambians, legal luminaries, to craft the laws and the decrees that enabled him, therefore, to remain in power and do just that. He fired people. He hired and fired judges. Very uncommon in other parts of the world. So,
the hiring and firing, what effect did that have, if you could tell?
I think it really put into question the fairness of the judicial system. It dismantled the infrastructure of the judicial system, more importantly. And over time, people really lost confidence. It was predictable what lay ahead of all victims or those who were accused or charged of crimes that many times were made up.
But what was the impact of the hiring and firing on the people who were hired and fired, the civil servants themselves?
Well, it created what I learned from you the other day, the Stockholm Syndrome, which is basically a psychological image in which those you victimize the most turn around to do your own bidding and come to love you, even despite those atrocities.
Well, we have heard of a number of people
Yes.
who are imprisoned by Jammeh, tortured by his subordinates or his men, who later on turned out to be Jammeh's biggest defenders.
Yes.
And that pretty much sums up what the Stockholm Syndrome is.
Yes. And that may not be unusual, lead counsel.
Proceed.
You find that that was also prevalent during the Nazi extermination of Jews in the concentration camps. It is not also unusual to find so-called terrorist groups and their captives falling in love or being endeared to their captors.
Well, we have heard that a person called Rambo Jatta was arrested and detained in several police stations around the country for over a period of a year and may have even been tortured.
Yes.
How would you describe his loyalty to Jammeh?
Along the same lines, I don't know him personally, but I have read and heard a lot about him. And I think he is a manifestation of that pathological, deeply troubled syndrome.
It's a disease of the mind.
Yes.
You, apart from some who suffered this Stockholm Syndrome, you also had civil servants who pretty much gave blind loyalty, even though they may have been sacked from their jobs and reinstated several times. We've heard of those who had 9 lives because they may have been sacked so many times, people lose count the number of times they've been sacked and reinstated. What do you say about that?
Well, Jammeh knew pretty much the psychology and the mentality of the Gambian elite. He loved them and he despised them at the same time. He used them and abused them. He misused them too. And his primary intention was to maintain his power at whatever cost. So people were fired, rehired, and then silenced. And once you were silenced, whatever you might have said about him in the past would be ignored. And before long, you were part of the cabal, so to speak. You became a beneficiary to the so-called perks within the regime. He understood very well the greed, the competition that informed the elite group. Our society is one predicated on extravagance, show me, showy, very externally oriented in our cultural manifestations. So Jammeh understood this very well. And he used this craftily to sideline, to disgrace, to silence, all in an effort to keep himself in power.
How about the professional associations, such as the Bar Association? Can you tell us about it?
The Bar Association is an important group in this country and have been for a very long time. They played important roles in the pre-independence period and thereafter. Lawyers were very important in the quest for independence in Gambia. And during the first 10 years of independence, were instrumental in maintaining law and order. Gambia was respected for its judicial liberal temperament, and this continued for a long time. Under Jammeh, on the other hand, the Bar Association gradually became silenced. Some of its members were co-opted into writing the decrees, and over time became complicit in the very violation of fundamental human rights. So, in time, they lost the respectability that they once enjoyed.
And in paragraph 40, you stated towards the tail end that there was ultimately a polarized and deeply politicized bar association.
Yes.
That was recreated as part of Jammeh's diabolical strategy of divide and conquer policy.
Yes, absolutely.
In fact, some do say that there were basically two bar associations, one run by a Nigerian Chief Justice and one run by the disaffected. Unfortunately, I wasn't here to know, but such is the story.
Yes.
Does your research reflect that?
I believe so. Even though the Jammeh loyalists were more dominant, and they clearly served him well, and in doing so, disservice to the Gambian population.
You went on to say, in the same paragraph 40, last line of page 16, various Nigerian chief justices followed suit and became effective tools of Jammeh.
Yes.
Yet, co-optation and inducements were not limited to the legal professionals, but were also extended to senior civil servants who served Jammeh in various cabinet-level positions that included Gambia's best and brightest.
Yes. Absolutely. It became very disconcerting to see well-respected Gambians in the senior civil service bracket being toyed with by Jammeh, who, for all intents and purposes, used them, abused them for his own ends.
Refused them too?
And refused them too, yes.
Your explanation is not even limited to just the violence that was perpetrated, the use of the law to entrench himself in power. You went on to discuss the use of cultural and social infrastructure to cement or sustain his regime. Can you expand on that?
That is a very interesting question. Other than the formal legal means that Jammeh used, he understood the personality and the culture and the operational code of Gambians. We are predominantly a very religious, in quote, people. But we also dabble in other traditions that include the occult. There is also a hierarchy in our societies built around superstition and belief in the jinn or devils and so forth and so on. He appropriated these effectively to consolidate power. He also was able to convince a lot of people that he knew more than he did. He had powers beyond the normal. He had paranormal powers, which many people believed. This is part of the building block of Gambian culture.
We
Kii dafa xam dara. Ay fen doon ne.
we have seen the changes in his personality.
Yes.
After he ditched the military uniform, we saw the green haftans.
Yes.
But that quickly disappeared. And suddenly it was all white,
Right.
subsequently thereafter.
Yes.
Does that represent anything in your research?
I think it did. I think he was using religion effectively, as many other politicians have in the past, to curry favor on one hand from those who are Muslim in this country, and at the same time consolidating his rule. So in other words, religion became another tool in the hands of Jammeh to consolidate, gain support from the clergy and imams, so as to, or some imams, some clergy, let me qualify that, in an effort to keep himself in power.
How about the use of religious symbols
Yes.
and paraphernalia?
Oh, yes.
Carrying the Quran
Yes.
and the sword. Did that have any effect?
I think it did to some people, yes. But it was, for me, personally, very distasteful. It embodied a personality that, for all intents and purposes, knew little of the Quran, maybe, in fact, dabbled in things that were anti-religious. He was said to partake of alcohol and other forbidden foods and engage in activities that were unreligious, un-Islamic, and so forth. It was a tool, in other words.
Paragraph 42 is quite interesting, what you have here. Could you read it out?
Can I read that? Okay. Thus, religious leaders and marabouts, sometimes one and the same, wielded considerable power over the aspects of society. In doing so, they not only serve as intermediaries and intercede on behalf of and between humans and God, but they also help legitimize those in power. The belief that a leader is sanctioned and installed by God is a belief commonly shared by all, the subtext of which is one does not challenge leaders installed by God, because when you do, you challenge God. Culturally, the way of saying, which has parallels in other Gambian languages, is that a stone does not wrestle with an egg, which basically means in Wolof, Dutch du borek, nen du borek Dutch. Dutch du borek nen, yes, sorry. Should I continue? Yes. Okay.
Yes, please.
They implore citizens to obey, not challenge the status quo, even under brutal conditions. The refrain is to leave it to God. Most Gambians internalize these cultural and religious beliefs, and by the time they are 10 years old. Traditional healers also play a vital role in addressing the spiritual as well as the medical needs of traditional believers, Muslims and Christians alike.
Yes, you raised this, how would I call it? Is it this wall of saying? Auntie Adelaide corrected it by saying it's nen du bëre ak doj.
Okay, I inverted it. Thank you.
Yes,
Commissioner.
so that correction has to
Yes.
has to be made.
Yes.
But Jammeh used religion effectively, from what you have said. We have seen images of Jammeh throwing water, and we hear that some of our more respected imams would call it to touch some of that water and rub it all over their bodies. Did your researches reflect anything like that? And what would that mean for Gambian society? What lessons do we draw from that?
Well, I've not heard of that particular instance, but the symbolism in itself is very telling. I think what it shows basically is the kind of control and power he was able to wield over the marabouts and the clergy and the imams and so forth and so on. If they have to go so low and revere Jammeh, who for all we know knew little about the Quran or the Bible, to me really talks about the low depth or the sycophancy of some, not all of them, because we had the Imam Fofanas and the others, Imam Babali, who stood up to Jammeh. For those that did not, and did as you suggest, I think it's very troubling to say the least.
But he also created a persona of a person with supernatural powers.
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
Well, I've been told that he in fact could conjure powers. He could see through people. He could consult with the Jalangs, and he could freeze you. He could just do practically anything he wanted to do because of these magical and supernatural powers. And I think he was able to convince a lot of people, especially for those patients who had HIV/AIDS, which led to disastrous consequences. In fact, there's a story about him trying to tame the bees on a tree that basically scattered and basically stung him quite severely.
The bees stung him when he was trying to tame them.
Yes. Absolutely.
And the fertility treatment?
And the what?
Fertility treatment?
Yes, the fertility treatments.
It's surprising he had only two.
2 children, yes. That's the irony, isn't it? But he was said to have had many lovers and raped a lot of women.
We had that evidence.
Yes.
Interesting. All this, as you said, created this image, which in the end led to a dictatorship. Paragraphs 45 and 46, actually through 47 of your report, is quite interesting. Could you kindly read it out?
Okay. Paragraph 45. In time, Jammeh misused his alleged healing skills to engage in wild sexual escapades with young women. He taunted Gambian men to surrender their wives to him if they needed proof of the efficacy of his concoctions. At another level, Jammeh made these utterances to drive a political wedge between husbands and wives, and between women and men more generally, given that women were an important constituency in his many electoral victories. Together with religious leaders whom he courted and won with generous gifts, his putative acts of piety and threats added significantly to Jammeh's political longevity and consolidation. Many would go to the extent that he was installed by Allah, and whoever opposed Jammeh opposed Allah. Resistance and self-determination, though permissible in Islam, were downplayed by him and imams in favor of a more conformist and docile political response. Thus, among most Gambians, only Allah could oust Jammeh, and when he lost the 2016 presidential elections, most attributed it to the will of God, not to the Gambian electorate. The Imam Ratib of Banjul, Imam Sheikh Charnoka, was at his beck and call. He in particular blessed Jammeh at state functions, prayed for him during Friday sermons, and visited State House to share in Jammeh's loot of Gambia's meager resources. These prayers notwithstanding could not avert Jammeh's fall from office. In sum, a cultural infrastructure informed and reinforced by religious beliefs in a country of professed Muslims and Christians helped support Jammeh and sustain his role. This cultural infrastructure was likewise used by Jammeh to rationalize his draconian rule and abuse of human rights specifically. Ultimately, a combination of military decrees, use and misuse of the judiciary, the repressive arm of the state, alongside a cultural and ideological superstructure, helped maintain Jammeh in power.
And for 22 years.
And for 22 years, yes.
Mr. Chair, perhaps this is a time to stop for lunch. Thank you.
The testimony of the witness is so illuminating. I think we probably can skip lunch and go on. Very good.
He would rather not. He would need his fuel.
Well, he wasn't running around the kitchen or the dining hall in Armitage.
I was going to say, he used to punish me.
We will take
I'll say something about that later.
No, be careful about that. It still can punish. But thank you again so much, Professor Saine. And we will take a 1-hour break and come back at 2:30. Okay. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.